Why hello there my tanukers, and welcome to my spoiler-free review of the new Netflix original anime by Studio Trigger, BNA, or Brand New Animal. Now, if you know me, you'd know that I'm a huge Gainax/Trigger fan, Gurren Lagann being my favorite anime of all time. The reason I say Gainax/Trigger is that Trigger is comprised of former Gainax employees, so both studios essentially have the same style. In essence, if you're a fan of one, you're a fan of the other. I even managed to see Promare in theaters, which was quite the experience, especially when getting blasted by Hiroyuki Sawano music. So when I learned that they were making a new show with a tanuki girl as the main character, I felt as if they were giving me a lion's share, and as such felt obliged to review it. Bias aside, is it any good? If you want me to hand you the TLDR as straight as the eagle flies, Michiru, the tanuki girl, is adorable, and I enjoyed the show quite a bit because how could I not with her as the main character? But I would only recommend it to people who are already fans of Trigger, like myself, or people who just like anthropomorphic animals for whatever reason that may be. Stick around for my elaboration so you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. In the meantime, I have to address the elephant in the room for anyone that's already seen episode 1, and that's the show pointing out the fact that tanukis don't have stripes on their tails. I know, cat's out of the bag. I sincerely apologize for keeping this a secret from everyone. I would have told you sooner, but I actually based the mascot off the tanuki suit Mario uses, and for whatever reason, Nintendo decided to give him stripes on the tail. I guess that goes to show you shouldn't get your biology knowledge from video game companies. Anyways, speaking of episode 1, it includes a little fan service cameo for people who are familiar with Trigger's first project, so keep a lookout for that if you start watching it. Despite the nice cameo, the first 3 episodes are not good, even a little cringy in their execution. Now, Trigger has never been one for subtlety, but despite that, their stupidest yet best shows like Gurren Lagann and Kill la Kill still have a certain level of sophistication under the surface layer. In BNA, the themes and possible metaphors are much more one-dimensional and almost childish in their delivery. My point is that it doesn't promote much ethical thinking when compared to the multifaceted themes and layers of the aforementioned shows. BNA feels more similar to Promare than Trigger's other works, and when I saw Promare for the first time, I noted that it had a plot similar to something you'd find in X-Men. However, BNA is even more similar to X-Men than Promare is. I don't mean for this observation to be negative, because I personally have always enjoyed X-Men and how it always entails a band of outcasts trying to make peace between these two factions which are very prejudiced against each other. Particularly, there's a scene in X-Men The Last Stand I saw as a kid which has always really stuck with me very strongly, and there's a certain plot element in BNA which echoed that same scene. This is all to say that BNA's mileage may vary depending on who's watching it. It's obviously going to speak a lot more to certain people than others, and that's perfectly fine. Strangely, the show doesn't really give any significant exposition or world building until the 4th episode, so I'll consider it a spoiler and withhold it. Episode 4 also has a scene which requires a bit of cultural knowledge, so I'll just let you know that tanukis in Japanese folklore use these magical leaves to transform. As for the general premise, Michiru goes to Anima City, which is supposed to be this shining paradise for all beastmen, but, of course, things aren't always what they seem. Naturally, the dark goings-on need weeding out, and fortunately there is one such character up for the job. That's Shiro, a wolf beast man that Michiru comes into contact with pretty early on. He's a super cool guy with a super cool deep voice that makes him super cool, and he wears a cool choker, or collar in this case. The English dub overall is good, but Shiro's voice in particular comes off as a little try-hard, so I actually prefer the Japanese audio, but like I said, both audio options are decent. Side note, the Beastmen in Gurren Lagann are not related to the Beastmen in this show. As far as anyone can tell, it is 2 separate universes. Thanks in part to his exceptional sense of smell, being a wolf and all, Shiro is a sort of private investigator who works for the leader of Anima City. Shiro takes Michiru under his metaphorical wing while investigating these crimes, eventually discovering this big conspiracy. It's loosely a mentor-student dynamic, with Michiru being the optimistic and naive one, while Shiro is obviously very experienced and cynical, but they're both pretty stubborn, which results in some antics and also some drama as they learn from each other along the way. Although they're not always paired up in the same scenes, their relationship carries the whole show for me, and the best parts overall are definitely when they're working together. Episode 5 is where I began to sincerely start enjoying this show, and it's also coincidentally the most trigger-feeling episode in terms of style and theming. Ironically, it's also the most episodic episode, containing a pretty self-contained arc about baseball of all things. This is also where I'd like to point out one of the more minor criticisms. For a while, I was not able to tell if I should be interpreting visual effects as being literal or not. Let me explain. Trigger's animation style often exaggerates visuals to an absurd degree. Being familiar with that, coupled with the given nature of this show specifically, I was often unsure about the level of canonical significance I should be putting on these transformations happening on screen. It does become more clear eventually, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a bit confused for a short time. Episode 6 marks the halfway point of the series, and I was pretty excited for it because it's a trend in Trigger shows to have a serious event happen in the middle, which leads to a drastic increase in scale for the latter half. However, Gurren Lagann and Kill la Kill, perfect examples of this trend, contain more than double the amount of episodes, Kill la Kill with 25 and Gurren Lagann with 27. As such, BNA's episode length of 12 limits the scale from growing into something of the usual galactic proportions. But episode 6 does in fact introduce a new element which drives the remainder of the season forward. Specifically, it introduces cult politics and later plays with the notion of an opiate of the people. I have to say, that was not the direction I was expecting the show to go, but I like it. Put simply, the second half is where BNA finds its identity after a pretty random first half. By episode 8, the rest of the story becomes pretty predictable, but it is executed in a satisfying way and wraps up everything nicely with just enough left unsaid to merit a season 2 should it ever get one. The show does reveal something pretty early, which I initially thought it should have saved, but the knowledge actually adds some effective irony later on. An additional thing related to spoilers is that the opening, as in the intro for each episode, spoils a different reveal intended for you to figure out around episode 7 or 8, so if you are really averse to spoilers, I suggest skipping the intros until then, either episode 7 or 8. It's also apparent by the end that most of the plot progression up to this point happened because of characters conveniently having the correct intel or merely being in the right places at the right time, but that is sort of a nitpick when considering everything took place in the same small city, or at least I'm assuming it's a sort of small radius. In summary, like I said at the beginning, I enjoyed it quite a bit, but can't recommend it to anyone that isn't already interested to some degree. If you like Gainax, Trigger, or even just the character designs, I'd say go for it, and if you can't bear the first few episodes, just skip straight to episode 5 so you can watch a fun baseball arc. If you're surprised I haven't compared BNA to Beastars yet, that's because I never finished Beastars, since Haru is an absolute hoe and Juno should be the love interest instead. And with all that said, I am Tanuki Tail. Do share your thoughts or questions in the comments, and I will see you all later.